You're listening to the Nourish Child Podcast, episode number 5, Top Baby Nutrients Parents Need to Watch.
Welcome to the Nourish Child Podcast, a show about childhood nutrition, feeding kids, and dealing with the ups and downs of growing a healthy child. Here's your host, registered dietitian and childhood nutrition expert, Jill Castle.
Hey there! If this is your first time tuning in, I am Jill Castle, a registered dietitian, nutritionist, and childhood nutrition expert. I've spent my 26-year career focused on children of all ages, from birth to 18 years, and the special concerns that surround nourishing them, feeding them, and all the food and feeding challenges that inevitably crop up over an 18-year childhood. Most recently, I have embarked on this podcast after I have spent the last 7 years writing about childhood nutrition on my blog, Just the Right Bite. My goals for the Nourish Child podcast are to cover current issues around childhood nutrition, help you navigate feeding your child, and educate you about the latest research and treatment approaches when dealing with eating, feeding, and the growing hurdles of raising children in the 21st century. So thanks for being here. I'm so happy you're here. And today, as I mentioned in the title, we're talking about the top baby nutrients parents need to watch out for. Why? Because food choices in the first 2 years of life, in part, establish the future health and intellect of your child. When I was writing up this episode, I couldn't help but reflect on what I did with my 4 kids long ago. My oldest is 19, so when I was feeding babies, it was quite a bit of time ago, and things have definitely changed. Yes, I've had my blunders, my oversights, and certainly I've had my regrets. And as I wrote this show, I started thinking about the different nutrients I'm going to talk about later on and how much more we know now than what we knew back then. Admittedly, it took me a long time to get over my embarrassment and regret that my first child had an iron deficiency at 18 months of age. And I wish there had been stronger recommendations for vitamin D when my kids were babies. I'm not even sure, nor can I really remember, if I was as consistent with the multivitamin supplement that I was giving them, if I was as consistent with that as I should have been. I would have loved to know what I know now then. And DHA, a healthy fat, that wasn't even on my radar 20 years ago. There has been lots of talk about babies and nutrition lately. In fact, last week, I think it was, I was interviewed by the New York Times for my perspective on vegan diets for babies. And the week before that, I was interviewed on the same topic for Self.com. And the reason being is that these stricter diets, such as the vegan diet, or even other eating plans, certainly highlight the potential dangers, that can be had by an inadequate diet for an infant. For example, in Italy, I think why the vegan diet for babies got such a publicity backing to it was because in Italy, 5 infants were hospitalized for severe malnutrition in the last year, and all 5 of them were on some sort of restrictive vegan diet. And even though Italy is proposing action to place parents, penalize them for placing their children on restrictive diets, I think this is all a result of lack of the proper information that parents need to have for their very young children when it comes to nutrients and nutrition. The other popular thing has been recently, too, in the media is skipping the vitamin K shot at birth. Some people, I guess, believe that vitamin K, that shot, is dangerous for the baby or even maybe toxic. while others believe that babies don't even really need vitamin K at birth. A newborn does not have enough vitamin K in their system to form a clot. And forming a clot is what prevents bleeding out and any kind of major blood loss. So babies are born with really low stores of vitamin K. And without that shot, which provides them a concentrated dose of vitamin K, given, a few hours after they're born, they wouldn't have enough vitamin K in their blood to form a clot. So when you put it into perspective, the highest risk for that baby is that it will spontaneously bleed into his tummy or into his intestines or into his brain. That's why the vitamin K shot is around. There's a lot of support in the literature for the validity and usefulness of that shot. The CDC has a policy on that, and I've linked their stance on vitamin K shots in infants right after birth in the show notes over at jillcastle.com/005. But according to the CDC, a baby who does not get the vitamin K shot is 81 times more likely to have a spontaneous bleed. And those babies who do not get that vitamin K shot are at risk for this kind of spontaneous bleed up to 6 months of age. So you certainly will make decisions for your own child, but I think the point of highlighting vitamin K and highlighting vegan diets is that they are two instances where we can see how important nutrients are to that young baby's health. We live in a world where we question everything about nutrition, and sometimes, the advice that we're hearing is coming from really vocal, popular people on social media who might not really even know what they're talking about when it comes to nutrition. But for me, as a childhood nutrition expert, oftentimes they don't know what they're talking about when it comes to babies and children. And that's where we have to be really, really careful. We are certainly learning more and more about early nutrition, not only its relationship to your child's future health, but we're learning a lot about its relationship to weight status later on and its role in the development of your child's intelligence and cognitive abilities. So we are on the cusp of new information coupled up with old, steady, standby information that's well established. It's an exciting time. But I think with all this new knowledge, we mustn't forget about nutrients. Remember, early nutrition and the nutrients that food provides are fundamental to your baby's body growth and development, as well as the growth of his brain and his later cognition. I like to think about nutrients as guiding my food choices and my feeding decisions for babies. That's how I practice with families, and that's how I think about food for my own growing children, is to think about the nutrients first and what are the critical things that need to be covered so that children grow well, develop well to their full potential. So sure, we're always going to see new diets, new food approaches, trendy feeding, ways to feed our babies in a trendy way. All of this can be sexy, it can be tempting, but the bottom line is any of these new food approaches or feeding trends need to cover the basic nutrient needs of the infant, and they need to have evidence and research behind them, proving they are safe and effective at nourishing your baby. Okay, so let's dig in and just quickly talk about what's going on with the brain and the body before we dig into the nutrients. So in the first 2 years of life, when you think about the brain, you can't miss the fact that a baby's head is proportionally larger than the rest of his body. There's an impressive amount of brain growth that happens in the first 2 years of life. In fact, I've read that 90% of the brain growth is completed within the first 2 years of life. So that's pretty amazing, and that's a pretty intensified period of time where the nutrients and the nutrition your baby's receiving is really important. We also know that malnourished babies, or babies who don't get enough calories or protein or specific nutrients in that early first 2 years, may develop lifelong behavioral and intelligence deficits that have lasting effects. Particularly nutrients like iron have been well established in the literature and in the research around the deficits of iron in a young child's diet, how those deficits can last for a long time and might not even be picked up until well into childhood. In terms of the body, we know that an infant's body weight goes up exponentially in the first year of life. Length doubles by a year, weight triples by the first year of life. Internal organs are growing, their functionality is developing. Just think about the gastrointestinal tract. It gets way more efficient and better able to digest and process complex food as your young child gets older. That's evident when you think about the liquid diet that they're on for the first year, and then they move that in that second half of the first year through solid food introduction. And as the diet gets more and more complex, the gastrointestinal tract gets more and more able to handle those different foods. Bones are also developing early on, and so we know that there are important nutrients like calcium and vitamin D that are integral to that process. So there's no denying that all nutrients are important for your child, but to me, a few stand out as ones you want to have your eye on, and to make sure that you're meeting those requirements with either liquid nutrition like infant formula or breast milk, or food or supplements if those are needed. You can head over to www.jillcastle.com/005 to get the show notes for this episode, and I will include a lot of helpful links there, but I'm also going to include a cheat sheet with the nutrients that I'm about to cover here, because again, it's a lot to remember. That cheat sheet will outline the different nutrients and why they're important for your baby. Again, you'll be able to get the baby nutrients you should be watching cheat sheet at www.jillcastle.com/005. That stands for episode number 5. Okay, let's talk about iron. So iron is very important for your baby. Iron maintains a sufficient number of oxygen-carrying red blood cells, and those fuel the growth of the brain. In general, we like to see babies who are breastfed to start receiving an iron supplement at around 4 months, and babies who are formula fed to receive an infant formula that contains iron. Typically, pediatricians will check your baby's iron status at the 1-year mark just to make sure they are sufficient in their iron stores, because iron sufficiency is definitely tied to a healthy brain and a healthy body and the growth of both. Statistically, iron deficiency occurs at rates between 0 and 15% worldwide, and iron deficiency anemia occurs at a rate of about 0 to 4% worldwide. And both of these percentages, these prevalence rates are occurring in 6-month-old infants. In America, 14% of children under age 2 are considered to be iron deficient. And as children get older, between 6 and 24 months worldwide, they are at higher risk for iron deficiency. So iron deficiency still exists, even though we've got this food system with all different kinds of food and availability like no other. We still have iron deficiency in America. An iron deficit can potentially cause impairment in cognitive, motor, and behavioral development. Some things that might surprise you about iron is that the iron requirements for babies jump up at 6 months of age. So in the first 6 months of life, they require less than 1 milligram of iron per day, but at that 6-month mark, their iron requirement jumps up to 11 milligrams per day. This is because there's a rapid rate of growth at that time, blood volume is expanding, and their body needs more iron. And if you're breastfeeding, your breast milk supply generally tends to drop off in its iron amounts for your baby. So there ends up being a little bit of a gap between what baby needs and what breast milk supplies. So at 6 months, that's why it's really important to introduce solid foods that are going to be a really good source of iron for your baby. So if you're breastfeeding, choosing iron-rich solid foods is an important consideration, and using that or starting that iron supplement I mentioned before around 4 months of age is a good idea. Babies who are fed infant formula should be on an iron-containing formula so that their iron requirements are met as well. I know I've told this story before, but my very own baby was iron deficient at 18 months of age. She was a big milk drinker. She loved fruit and vegetables and grains, and she preferred those foods over other iron-rich foods such as meat or poultry, chicken, or beans. And unfortunately, at our 18-month checkup, she had an iron deficiency. You know, it still bothers me to think about that. It's one of those, how did that happen? How did I let that happen? But the reality is, I was using good feeding practices. I was using the division of responsibility, and I was trying very hard to let my daughter take the lead on eating what I offered her and deciding how much she would eat. She was in charge of that. And oftentimes she was drinking her milk and eating her fruit and being done with her meal. So you can see all of this nutrients and nutrition can be quite complicated, even when we're using the best practices we know. The other thing I'll say about iron deficiency is that children who are food insecure may be more susceptible to iron deficiency, particularly if they aren't plugged in or utilizing the supportive services such as WIC, the Women, Infants, and Children program, or other supplemental food programs. So that's just something to think about. Iron deficiency isn't only occurring in food insecure children, it's also happening in all social demographics in the U.S. Another nutrient that's really important for babies is DHA. DHA stands for docosahexaenoic acid, and it's an essential fatty acid typically found in fatty fish and some other foods. But mainly what DHA does for your baby is it plays a critical role in the brain and the development of the retina in the eye in the first 24 months of life. So basically, DHA is tied to your baby's vision, his attention, his memory, and his overall cognitive functioning. And so a deficit in DHA can cause problems with vision and attention, memory, and other functions involving cognition. Things that might surprise you about DHA is that most infant formulas now have DHA included, but you should always check just to make sure. And when you can, you should choose an infant formula that has DHA included in it. DHA is also in breast milk. So typically a baby who is breastfeeding will get enough DHA in their diet, but it is dependent on the mother's diet. So moms who don't eat any fish at all or who might not be taking a DHA supplement might not have a good supply of DHA in their breast milk. So you want to make sure that if you are nursing, that your diet is healthy and a good source of DHA is present in your diet. During the first year of life, things might be good on the DHA front, but at around a year, when the solid food diet takes over and babies start to either wean themselves from breastfeeding or you've switched your baby from infant formula over to whole milk, the regular diet, the regular solid food diet may not provide enough DHA. Again, remember, DHA is found in a short list of foods. And so babies need to be having a really good source of fatty fish in their diet a couple of times a week. One researcher out of North Carolina by the name of Carol Cheatham has identified that about 7% of the U.S. population cannot make DHA in their body. And this might be detrimental to the developing fetus and the breastfed baby. So these moms who can't make DHA need to be taking a DHA supplement so that they're getting enough, but also so that their baby is getting enough. But not only in Americans, she's found that 11% of Canadians aren't making DHA within their body. 50% of Eastern Chinese individuals are not making DHA themselves. And nearly 100% of the Inuit population don't make DHA within their bodies. So what she's proposed in that case scenario is that they have a diet that's very rich in fatty acids. And because of that, the gene for making DHA has just gradually disappeared from their genome. Cheatham states that about 2.5% of all babies cannot make DHA within their body either. It's very interesting research. I tell you about that just to give you some things to think about. I don't know that we have the exact answers because even though we have prevalence rates of this inability to make DHA, it doesn't mean that we're able to pinpoint which mothers can't make DHA and which babies aren't making DHA. But I do believe it's an important enough nutrient that you should consider making sure there is a good source of DHA in your infant's diet in the first year of life. But when your baby starts to be reliant on a solid food diet in the second year of life, that's where I really think you have to put conscientious effort into making sure that the foods that you're serving your child are good sources of DHA. I'm going to link to a nice little summary of Carol Cheatham's work in the show notes so you can read what she's doing and even perhaps look at some of her studies. They're very interesting. Okay, the other nutrient we need to talk about is total fat. This might be one of the only times during your child's life when a high-fat diet is desirable. In fact, almost 50% of calories that your baby's consuming should come from a fat source. Breast milk naturally has this composition, and infant formula mimics that fat composition. So when your baby is on breast milk or infant formula, they're getting just the right amount of fat that they need for development. Total fat in your baby's diet supports the rapid rate of myelination in the brain, and it also supplies a concentrated calorie source to support accelerated growth in the first 2 years. Deficits in fat, or when your baby isn't getting enough fat, you may see poor weight gain and poor growth. You might even see failure to thrive, a condition when gains in weight and length stop. Things that might surprise you about total fat in your baby's diet. Number one, with our health-conscious world, some parents have gotten too overzealous with limiting fat in their young children's diet to the extent of potentially causing problems with their growth and development. Remember, in the first year, it's about 50% of total calorie needs, and as your child ages, those fat requirements go down. So, for example, a 2-year-old needs about 30 to 40% of their calories coming from fat. And the older child and even the adult needs about 30% or less coming from fat. In the first year, your baby should receive breast milk or infant formula. At 1 year, transition over to a full-fat milk source or a milk substitute that has a good amount of fat in it, like soy milk. You can feed your baby or young toddler full-fat yogurt, full-fat cheeses, plant sources of fat like avocado and olive oil, and be sure to cook with fat. No need to steam those vegetables. You can saute them in olive oil to provide some extra healthy fat calories. Vitamin D. Vitamin D is talked about a lot, but you might not realize that rickets, a condition of low vitamin D intake, is making a comeback. Rickets is a softening of the bones in the legs, causing a bow-legged appearance. Prevalence is about 24 cases per 100,000 since the year 2000, which is up dramatically over the past 40 years. We see rickets in the Black population, in breastfeeding infants, in babies with low birth weight, and in children with stunted growth. That's where it is associated with those specific populations. So it's not only just a low vitamin D situation. Statistics tell us that from 10 to 78% of unsupplemented babies have a vitamin D deficiency. In fact, last year around this time, I was talking to a pediatrician at a meeting I was at, and we were talking about vitamin D, and I thought it was so interesting. He said, every time I check a child's vitamin D status, it's always low. I cannot remember once where the vitamin D level came back normal. Now, this pediatrician was living in Vermont, so they are in a higher latitude and the sun exposure may be less. That has, I'm sure, something to do with it. But I thought that was very, very interesting to hear that from him. All babies who are breastfed should be receiving a vitamin D supplement. If your baby isn't, you need to talk with your pediatrician or your nutrition professional. And believe me, I hear time and time again about babies who aren't getting a vitamin D supplement. So that's too bad, because we know it is a standard recommendation that all babies, when they leave the hospital, that they start on a vitamin D supplement, particularly if they are breastfeeding. In an infant formula, your baby will get the vitamin D he needs, but in a breastfeeding baby, you need to add a supplement. Vitamin D enables deposition of calcium into the bones. It helps shuttle calcium into the bones, and calcium hardens the bone. If you need to or are interested in learning more about calcium, I have an ebook on my website entitled The Calcium Handbook for Kids, 100 Ways to Grow Healthy Bones. Again, you can find that on my website, jillcastle.com. So vitamin D deficits are linked to poor immunity, poor bone health, and chronic disease. One thing that might surprise you about vitamin D is that it's very hard to meet your child's vitamin D requirements with food sources alone. There aren't very many natural sources of vitamin D. You can find it in fatty fish and in mushrooms, for example. But we do have, thankfully, several fortified foods. Milk is fortified with vitamin D. Some yogurts are fortified with vitamin D. Not all of them, so you do need to read the label to make sure it's included. Ready-to-eat cereals oftentimes are fortified with vitamin D, and other food products. Vitamin D is called the sunshine vitamin for good reason, because the sunshine activates vitamin D in the skin and can increase the blood levels of vitamin D through the sun. Today we're using a lot of sunscreen to prevent cancer, and that's a good idea, but it poses a challenge for getting vitamin D through the skin. If your child's always covered up in sunscreen, you may be blocking out the ability to activate vitamin D in the skin. The Vitamin D Council advises sun exposure without sunscreen for what they call half the time it would take you to start to burn. So that's sort of a vague description, but I guess if you know your child's tendency, if you're very fair-skinned and your child's skin starts to turn pink within 5 minutes, you would have them out in the sun for 2 minutes or 3 minutes. Other people who are darker complected and aren't going to burn so readily might be able to stay out in the sun a little bit longer. The Vitamin D Council says the more skin you expose, the more vitamin D activation you get. Just to give you more information on that, I think when it comes to vitamin D, you're going to want to make sure that you're finding some good food sources for your child, but also to know that you're probably not going to hit the requirement of vitamin D from food alone. So in breastfed babies, having a vitamin D supplement on a daily basis is key. And in the older child, when you're switching over to solid foods, making sure that you do include solid foods like fortified milk or yogurts or cereal that have vitamin D present in them to help your child attain that vitamin D requirement that they need. It may be that you need to keep your child on a vitamin D supplement just to make sure he or she is getting enough vitamin D in their regular diet. So a few things to remember as we wrap up this show. Nutrients are critical to your baby's brain development and body growth. Make sure you check out those popular alternative diets and feeding approaches to make sure they offer and cover the nutrients your baby or young toddler needs adequately. Just because it's a popular trend doesn't mean it's good for your baby. And then last, the first 2 years are crucial for the future health and intellect of your child, and nutrition can really matter and add to success in those areas. Okay, that pretty much covers it for today's episode, the baby nutrients you should be aware of. Don't forget to head over and get the show notes at www.jillcastle.com/005, which stands for episode number 5. I will have more links and resources there for you. If you want the cheat sheet for this episode, it will be there too. Again, jillcastle.com/005. Once more, if you want to learn more about calcium and your child's bone development, health, and growth, check out my ebook, The Calcium Handbook for Kids, over on my website. If you enjoyed the show, there's a few things you can do to help the Nourish Child podcast reach more people. Write a review on iTunes, subscribe to the show, or share the podcast on your social media channels. Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Pinterest, wherever you hang out. Let your peers know about the Nourish Child podcast. And last, but certainly not least, if you're not receiving my weekly newsletter yet, you can sign up on my website, my blog, Just the Right Bite, or through my Facebook page, Just the Right Bite with Jill Castle. As always, thanks for joining me today. I am so very glad you were here. Be sure to give that little one in your life a big squeeze today. Bye for now.
Thanks for listening to the Nourish Child podcast, where the #1 goal is to help you grow a nourished child inside and out.